Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Sheet, and I will be helping you be smarter and safer travelers in your journey through capital. You've heard of it before. That genuine, one-of-a-kind adventure that'll take you all the way through crystal blue waters of option pools, away to the dividends of the earth. Now, put on your valuation caps and hold on tight as we go through just some of the stops that you'll see on this exciting journey. But first, we want to introduce this roadmap that companies commonly go through in order to finance their startup. Now, often, the first first round of external fundraising that your company might receive is through something called a convertible debt or convertible equity instrument. That would be in the form of a convertible promissory note, or perhaps one of these other agreements like a SAFE agreement or KISS agreement, followed by venture capital financing rounds, these larger, more institutional investors getting involved, uncreatively named Series A, Series B, Series C. Typically, these might be anywhere between 12 and 18 months from each other in terms of these various stops. And finally, there might be an IPO or acquisition event. This would be commonly known as as a liquidation event, where the investors and the company founders finally be able to cash out on their startup, either by listing on the stock market or being acquired by a larger company. But for purposes of this conversation, this workshop, we're going to be focusing on the convertible notes and the venture capital. Now, luckily, we have been able to kind of convert our travel brochure into PowerPoint form. So first up, we've got the convertible note with that. Now, it's an oldie but a goodie. The convertible note itself, it's structured essentially like a loan when an investor enters into a convertible note agreement with you. They're essentially saying, here is this pile of money, and we'd like to loan that to your company. And through the company, the company itself, in terms of valuation, they're essentially going to kick the can down the road. It's currently just too early to tell how much this company is going to be worth, because there's not real evidence of market traction and evidence of sales, being able to figure out projected cash flows in the future. And so the idea is, once your company does raise a venture capital round or gets acquired by a larger company, at that point, there will be a set valuation for the company. And thus, for the convertible note round, there's no upfront pricing. There's no upfront valuation event to figure out that, oh, wait, this $100,000 convertible note is going to convert into 5% of the equity of the company. That's not going to be stated here. It's possible that that is the equity split, or how that would go. But there are a number of terms that could affect the amount of equity that the convertible note turns into. Because the way it's structured is this loaned pile of money, and that money, that loan, can be converted into a percentage of ownership of equity in the company at a later date. Now, terms that would affect the amount of equity that the investor receives would be the discount rate, the valuation cap, and we'll go through these examples of these in a few slides later on. First, I want to kind of call out the debt features of this kind of instrument. Now, this is a loan, so there's a maturity date and an interest rate attached to them. Maturity date is usually set between 12 and 18 months from now, so that's when the loan would be due, or the investor would have the option to convert. There's also interest rate kind of attached to that loan. Generally speaking, this term of between 2 to 7%, the investors themselves who are investing in early stage startup companies and entering into these convertible debts, they're not too interested in this whopping 2 to 7% return on their investments. Usually they're contemplating this 10x, 100x return on their investment one day. And also for that reason, prepayment, the ability for the company to prepay the loan back so that the investor doesn't receive a portion of equity to convert their loan into. That's typically explicitly disallowed because the investor really wants a piece of the company. They don't really want to offer these loans to very speculative startups trying to make their business for 2 to 7% of return. They want a significant portion of the company. Finally, we have the pro rata participation term. This is the ability for the investor, the right for the investor to put in more money in subsequent financing rounds. So when you raise from a venture capitalist, There's going to be a set price for the company, and the pro rata participation right allows for the convertible note investor to keep buying additional shares to maintain their ownership percentage. Now, I know what you're thinking, Kevin. Sure, there's no upfront pricing in this travel package, but there's got to be some kind of catch. First, there are many catches, and you should definitely hire an attorney to represent your best interests when entering into any kind of transaction like this. But one particularly tricky situation that comes to mind is the topic of liquidation preference overhang. Now, this issue, it's kind of like a situation of like you'd see in Pirates of the Caribbean, where you wouldn't actually know how to arrive at this term unless you've been to Capital Land before. And it's particularly tricky because it has to do with a set of circumstances that can occur but are not explicitly stated in the convertible note agreement itself. It relies on the agreements that happen afterward, and it has the potential of allowing the convertible note investor to make a lot more money than they put in. In general, that's what the investor wants, but typically it is less ideal for the subsequent investors and possibly the founders as well. But we'll get into that in later slides. Next up, we have the SAFE and KISS financing instruments. Now, the SAFE agreement is called the acronym for the Simple Agreement for Future Equity. It's put out by Y Combinator. The KISS agreement is the Keep It Simple Security for private startups. What I mentioned about the interest rate and maturity date from the convertible note agreement slides, you can see that they lack the debt features as compared to comparing the KISS agreement with the SAFE agreement with the convertible note. The idea is that the architects of these streamlined agreements, they figured that most investors just don't really care about a 2 to 7% return on their investment, and if they ever really tried to collect that loan from the company would just fold. And so the investors wouldn't really make that 2 to 7% anyway. So the idea was that since no one really cares about this, let's just get rid of it altogether so people don't have to waste time and energy bargaining over, company might say like, hey, we are only allowing 3% interest. The investor says, well, we want 7%. But really no one actually cares about this particular term. So that way it's much more streamlined. There are a number of other provisions that are cut out so that it really just focuses on the terms that most early stage investors really care about. You'll see the difference in page length. The SAFE comes in at 4 pages, the KISS at 8 pages, and a more traditional convertible promissory note might come in at 20 pages. And this issue of liquidation preference overhang, the KISS and SAFE do handle through what's called a shadow series of stock, which we'll go into in a few slides. And then finally, we have the venture capital financing rounds. These are the larger, more institutional investors where you as the company will be bargaining with the institutional investors and their army of financial analysts and lawyers to come up with a fair valuation for your company. And so at this point, there is going to be a valuation, this price attached to your company. And this is why we refer to a venture capital round, a Series A, Series B, Series C, as a priced round, as opposed to an unpriced round of a convertible note. In a venture capital round, you do come up with some price for the company. The pre-money valuation would be the amount that your company is worth prior to the venture capitalist writing a check. You would probably give up some control of the company in the form of board seats. You will set up the size for the option pool. So there's going to be a certain amount of stock that's reserved from the company to compensate the early and senior managers of the company. Also anti-dilution provisions where the investors, the VC investors that come in and perhaps the higher investors as well would receive the benefit of anti-dilution, where if the company's value goes down during a subsequent round, that these investors would be able to convert their existing stock into something, into more stock in order to make up for the difference. Because the idea is that if 12 to 18 months from now, the company is actually worth less, the existing investors aren't too happy with that. So as a way to make things whole, they would receive more stock in exchange. And then we have the issue of a very touchy subject of participating versus non-participating preferred stock. This has to do with what happens in a cash out situation of, well, either the company folding or the company getting acquired. If the investors themselves would be able to get maybe some portion of the amount of money that they put in initially, and then be able to split the proceeds from the sale of that company, or if the investor would have to choose between whether to take all their stock and share kind of equally with all the founders, rather than grabbing up part of their purchase price, part of their investment amount beforehand. And yep, so this would be a much more involved series of transactions that's compared to the convertible note or the safe and KISS rounds. This is going to really change the formative documents within your company and produce these different classes of stock that the investor class would be able to have certain rights over. But that's, with that, we're going to now turn it over to our live studio audience for questions. Over there, it seems like we have a question over there.
Yes. Well, I took a trip to Capital Inn a few years back, and, everything seemed to go pretty well. I mean, I found this angel investor quickly, and we negotiated a super low valuation cap, but then everything seemed to go downhill. I mean, the next time we tried to raise a financing round, we couldn't get any investors to bite. I mean, it just ruined the whole trip. I mean, what do we do?
I see.
What did we do wrong?
It can be a kind of common condition or set of circumstance that happen. This sounds like a good time for us to go through our examples of discount rates and valuation cap. Now, first with the discount rate, this has to do with kind of a sweetener that the convertible note investor would receive because they're investing in the company earlier on. Remember that the timeline in terms of the roadmap was that you start with a convertible note investment probably, and then you move on to an institutional investor, like a VC, where your company is priced at a certain amount. Let's say we take this example of a $100,000 promissory note that the convertible note investor entered into with a 20% discount rate on the dollar amount that they'll be converting into. And let's say at Series A, during this price round, the company's found to be worth $1 per share. So this is the amount of money that the Series A investors will be paying for each share that they purchase at the Series A round. So you would think, okay, well, the convertible note investor, when they write this $100,000 check, they should be converting at $1 per share, so they should receive 100,000 shares. Would be fine. This would be the same terms as what the VC investors receive. However, you might have an objection as well, because the convertible note investors, they would have written that check 12 to 18 months, maybe even longer, before the Series A investors got in anyway. Sure, the Series A investors are probably writing a much larger check, but the angel investor, the investor that entered into the convertible note, they got in a lot earlier, like a lot earlier in the company's life cycle in terms of making their product, in terms of making sales. And so it was a lot more risky for the convertible note investor than the Series A investors. And so the idea is that the convertible note investor should be rewarded proportionally. Right? So with a 20% discount rate, the convertible note investor would instead convert at 80 cents per share rather than $1. And so they would receive 125,000 shares rather than just 100,000 shares. Now next up we have the valuation cap, and this is what you mentioned, sir, when it comes to the valuation cap amount. If it is a very low cap, that's very good for the investor, but not as good for the company, because what happens with the cap is that the valuation cap acts as a ceiling for the value of the company that will be used with respect to converting that convertible note investor's loan into equity. So in this example, it's a $100,000 promissory note, convertible promissory note, a 20% discount rate, and a valuation cap of $2.5 million. In this case, it's a Series A. The company is found to be worth as a whole $5 million, and priced at $1 per share. Great. For this investor who holds the convertible note with a $2.5 million cap, the company is going to be treated as if the company is only worth $2.5 million. And so the convertible note investor would be converting at 50 cents per share, as opposed to the $1 that the Series A investors are converting at or purchasing at. And so that convertible note investor would be receiving 200,000 shares for their $100,000 check size. And you might say, like, oh, okay, well, if the cap was set at a very low price, this probably means that both the convertible note investor and the company founders, they figured, oh, okay, maybe the size of the marketplace isn't so large. Maybe for whatever reason, they just figured that the company wouldn't be worth as much. And so it was a much more risky proposition for the investor to invest at that time. And that's why the cap is set so low. But yeah, it turns out it was just a rocket ship. They were able to make all these sales, and the company can be valued at much higher than the valuation cap. The issue is that if the convertible note investors are converting at 50 cents per share, but the Series A investors are purchasing into $1 per share, typically what happens is that an investor, it is less than ideal for an investor to be paying much more than someone else is paying for the same stock. And so it tends to be not as palatable for Series A investors or any subsequent investors to get in if the valuation cap is set much lower than the actual valuation of the company. Because if you can imagine, if either the valuation of the company at Series A was much higher or the cap was much lower, right now it's 50 cents per share, but it could have been 10 cents per share. The Series A investors are paying $1. It just tends to be a troublesome figure. And so often the Series A investors might say that the only way we would be willing to enter into this round is if the convertible note investors agree to renegotiate this valuation cap or somehow change the share price so that it's not so much of a lopsided. Let's see, any other questions? Oh, yeah, question over there.
So I was part of a company that was really taking off, and we were having a great time at all the stocks you mentioned, convertible notes, Series A financing, Series B, C. But then our growth started to slow down, and it just seemed like we couldn't adjust our business model to meet with it. So long story short, our company ended up getting bought by another business, and it was for a few $100 million. So I thought it was amazing, But at the end of it, I just didn't make very much money at all. It was pretty underwhelming, I gotta say. Like, what gives?
Wow, yeah, like hundreds of $1 millions in acquisition, but for the founders themselves, they didn't seem to make very much money. And this sounds like a good kind of segue into our topic of liquidation preference overhang, this issue that I've flagged before in previous slides. The liquidation preference attached to a share essentially says that if the company undergoes some kind of event like an acquisition, the investor would receive their money back. So typically the liquidation preference would be set at a 1x multiplier, meaning that if the company gets bought back and the convertible note investor put in $100,000 and they convert it into 125,000 shares of stock, each of those shares would be essentially counted as $1, this purchase price from the Series A figure, so that the angel investor would receive $125,000 in liquidation. So if the company gets bought out, the angel investor would get their investment back in the form of $125,000. And you might notice that this is larger than the check size that they wrote initially to enter into this agreement. Right? They only made this loan for $100,000, but because they converted into something higher due to the discount rate, they would receive $125,000 in liquidation preference. And so this additional $25,000, that's what we refer to as the liquidation preference overhang. And in this example, you might say, oh, well, this angel investor, they got in really early. They should be rewarded for that. Right? And maybe this extra $25,000 is fine. But in the case of a liquidation preference overhang with the valuation cap, as you might recall from our previous example, the valuation, due to the valuation cap, the convertible note investor can get 200,000 shares. And if it's left unstated, they would receive $200,000 in liquidation preference. And so during this acquisition event, they would be entitled to twice the amount of money that they put in. Now, this is a much larger overhang, and you could see how this can snowball quite quickly, especially if the liquidation preference multiple is something higher than 1x, it could be 2x, 3x. It could be that the valuation itself is much higher than the cap. It could be a very high discount rate. And so, as a result, the company itself might have the investors that have bought into the company, they might have a lot of liquidation preferences outstanding, and they could have taken much more money than they've actually invested. So that might be one possibility for why the company founders would have a smaller slice of the pie, so to speak. Another possible issue is that the investors might have received participating preferred stock. This has to do with the order in which cash out events happen. So you see here, it triggers if the company is sold through this liquidation event. For investors that have a participating preferred stock, what happens is that the investors would receive their investment amount based on their liquidation preference multiple, B1x, 2x, 3x, whatever that is. And then the investors could convert that preferred stock into common stock and share kind of proportionally with the rest of the company founders. So a brief example, let's say that yes, this is what happens. Investors put in $3 million at a $7 million pre-money valuation, 1x liquidation preference, and the company gets sold for $20 million. With this participating preferred stock, so if the company is sold for $20 million, the investors put in $3 million, the investors would receive that $3 million back immediately. And the investors would convert their preferred stock into common stock, and the investors that would equate to 30% of the company. And so at this point, all of the common stockholders, which are the investors plus the founders now, they would share in those proceeds. So the remaining $17 million would be split between the investors and the founders after the investors get the $3 million back. Now this is in contrast to the non-participating preferred stock case, where the investors have to choose. They can't get their liquidation preference back immediately. They have to choose either they want their liquidation preference back, or they can decide to convert into common stock immediately, and then they will just share the money, the $20 million, with the company founders. The rest of the equity holders do that method. And so in this case, it would make sense for the investors to convert, but there can be situations where their liquidation preference would be more than they would have made anyway, and so they might choose that instead. You can see the delta is pretty stark here. That's the difference. The founders would receive 11.9 million in this case, and the founders would receive $14 million in this case, so $2.1 million additional to the founders if it were non-participating preferred stock. That's a pretty sizable sum to me, but that also may have happened in your case, maybe. But yeah, got a bunch of next slides now. But yeah, we wanted to turn it over to our online audience and the other participants in this workshop as well for non-scripted questions.
I have a question. Should we be forming in Delaware to make these financial transactions go better, or no?
That's a very good question, sir. Now, when it comes to investors, if you want to cast the widest possible net for institutional investors who are kind of dead set on venture capital financing, this hockey stick kind of growth, then yeah, it probably makes sense to incorporate in Delaware. This is the company, I guess I'd put it this way, like every investor, every professional investor would be comfortable investing in a Delaware corporation. But many investors would also be comfortable investing in a California corporation. There's plenty of bodies of corporate law in California as well. Plenty of great companies that are incorporated in California as well. eBay, Apple. You're not in a terrible company if you incorporate in California. So yeah, I guess I'd put it that way. If you really want to dress up for the capital ball, that's what I put it, then it makes sense to incorporate in Delaware. If you're at a stage where in the company where you could go through this high growth VC backed phase, or you might just kind of bootstrap and rely only on internal funding, then it might make sense to just incorporate in California instead. Because if you incorporate in Delaware and you operate in California, what will happen is that you'll need to qualify to transact interstate business in California. So you'll register as a pseudo foreign corporation in California. And the California Franchise Tax Board will levy California franchise taxes on your company anyway. And so you'd just be paying the state franchise taxes in both states. And you'd have to comply with Delaware corporate code as well. So yeah, there would be more transaction costs if you were to incorporate in Delaware. Could be well worth it if you're aiming for these larger institutional investors. But if it's possible that you stay self-funded, then it might make sense to start in California and maybe reincorporate later to move the state incorporation to Delaware at a later time. Any other questions? Okay.
All right, good. Well, tell them next
it was a
workshop
pleasure
next year.
speaking with you. Yeah.
After the first of the year, we'll be back on the 20.
That's right, third Friday after the first of the year, we will be back.
The 18th.
January 18th.
January 18th. Tune in then again for more workshops, and do check us out for office hours. Maybe right up here, quickly the website.
Yes.
To sign up.
Yeah.
Maybe on the white.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, okay. There we go. From here, there'll be an events page you can check out. Sign up for office hours.